We actually have some really interesting evidence that your leadership and your workplace now has more of an influence on your well-being than your doctor does. So yeah, leadership is a really, really big part of this.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of GOBO. That's Glimpses of the Blindingly Obvious, where we skip the expert waffle and dive into what's right in front of us, staring right back. I'm your host, Joe Espana, and I'm inviting you to take a second look at subjects and see if we can figure out what's been hiding in plain sight. Lately, I've been mulling over well-being at work. Are all the initiatives worth the time, money and effort? Is the dial of workplace well-being actually being moved? Well, of course, the best person I could think of to mull over these questions is my good friend Gethin Nadin, the award-winning psychologist, best-selling author, influential HR thinker, and all-round good egg. Gethin knows a lot about well-being at work, so I wanted to ask him this question. Workplace well-being, is it a complete waste of time? Hi, Gethin. How are you? Lovely to see you, and thank you for joining us on this podcast of GOBO, Glimpses of the Blindingly Obvious. And maybe our subject today is blindingly obvious. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Really happy to be joining you today. Thanks for having me on.
Brilliant. So I wanted to have a chat with you really around your books, brilliant, great read, around well-being and why it is. So I guess it's kind of a little bit of a retrospective chat really as to what's been happening with well-being and why it's not really where we'd like it to be, particularly with all the initiatives that organizations have in place and the plethora of apps that have emerged probably since before the pandemic and definitely after it. Why don't we kick off with maybe framing this idea of well-being and maybe defining it a bit? What would be your definition of well-being at work?
Yeah, it's a good question. I get asked this quite a lot whenever I do conference talks on well-being. The reality is there is no universally agreed definition of well-being, let alone workplace well-being. There are various different models out there, various different descriptions, and people define it in very different ways. For me, I take a combination of a few things from people like the World Health Organization, the Office for National Statistics in the UK. You get all these different measures of how well people are doing in society and a measure of well-being. Lots of states now tend to do something to measure people's well-being. And I take that as a jumping off point to really define what makes people well in life, and especially in the workplace. And that tends to include, when you're thinking above and beyond your food in your belly and a roof over your head, you then start to look at the stuff that really makes a difference to most people, because most people listening to this podcast are probably quite lucky in that kind of top 5% in the world that does have some of the basics in place in that kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you want to look at it that way. And so effectively, you're looking at things in the workplace around clear communication, trust between you and your employer, and being recognized for the effort that you put in, being rewarded appropriately for the effort that you put in, the relationships you have with your colleagues, how much you're trusted to work in an autonomous way and have a lot of autonomy in your role, and how high your psychological safety is. How often can you contribute your thoughts and feel like they're going to be listened to and you're not going to get shot down for kind of contributing in a way. And so there's all these kind of organizational structure type things that come out when you start to look at what makes people happy in the workplace. Compared with that, then you really balance the fact that what abilities have people got to handle the things that might go wrong or stress them out, the kind of resources they might have, and then how many challenges they're dealing with. And it's almost like a seesaw. So if you've got enough resources, you can deal with most of the problems that life will throw at you. And most of us do that fairly effectively. People get over relationships and arguments with their partners, and people fall out with their friends, but get back together. And what tends to happen is when it balances too much and the things that are overwhelming you, you do not have the resources to kind of fend those off. That's when you start to see some problems. The pandemic is a good example of that. People didn't have the resources to be able to deal with the effect the pandemic had on their well-being. And so for me, that's how I define well-being. It's about how we're giving people the opportunity to live fulfilling lives in the workplace, supporting their lives outside of work, and how much are we contributing to that box of resources that people have available so that they can better deal with the stuff that life will throw at them.
Thank you. I really love that framing. As you were talking, my own sort of entry point into the subject, given the work I do with my clients, there's always been a massive overlap, I think, in my head around the notion of engagement at work and what contributes to how I feel about being at work.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
there's all the sort of other component factors, my physical wellness, my physical ability to do the work that's expected of me, my mental state, how I feel about my team, how I feel about my manager, and all that kind of stuff. So it kind of, there's so much overlapping with the notion of trust, a person's resourcefulness to be able to deal with everything that's being thrown at them, kind of thing. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this. This has probably been happening cumulatively over many years. I don't have any hard data to back up this assertion that I'm going to make, but just sort of anecdotally working with leaders, etc., in lots of different industries, I just think people are so maxed out. The demands
oh,
on our being at work and being productive and managers, never mind the general workforce, is just phenomenal. I think it's a major
yeah.
contributor to all of this.
I think it's a really good point because when we think about the workplace, a lot of the research out there at the moment is pointing to the fact that one of the reasons we connected again recently was this new research from Oxford University saying workplace wellbeing initiatives are a waste of time and money and you shouldn't bother with them at all. And that's been really widely reported on because it's controversial. It's going against the grain at the moment. People really leapt on top of that. Um, it's not the first of its kind that's come out in the last couple of years. There's been multiple huge workplace wellbeing initiative studies taking place. Chicago University have done a few, California have done a few. And these are really big studies covering hundreds, if not thousands, of employers and millions of employees. Most of them have found that these initiatives don't really move the dial. You see some positive impacts of these initiatives. What they fail to do across all these studies is really give you a list of what are those initiatives. They don't really break them down in a way that you can really understand. Some of them include things like alcohol and smoking cessation, and that is an addiction, and it's much harder behavior to overcome than me trying to get an employee to run a little bit more or take a few breaks from their screen during the days. It's not really comparative. And I think what they also do is they pit health and well-being initiatives in the workplace, which include education on healthy eating, managing your relationships. It might include mindfulness meditations. It might include all these different kind of features you tend to see in mental health apps that help people with some of these issues. People are saying it's not about health and well-being initiatives. It's about good leadership, autonomy, psychological safety, and a great culture. And I'm like, yeah, of course it is. Like, I don't see, you can't go into a really horrible culture where people are pushed down with the boot on their head and then just give them a mental health app and expect that to change. And I think the reality is, I don't believe most organizations do that. There is a lot of this well-being washing. If you look at some research published in people like the CIPD, they've suggested about a third of companies well-being washed. So that's basically doing a few performative things that aren't really making a difference to their people. I don't think it's necessarily that widespread. There's a basic set of organizational structure things you need to change to better serve people's well-being. And then you can add these things on top and they start to complement that and make it better. We continue to pit the health and well-being industry against good leadership and what it is to run a good business. Actually, I think you need both of those things. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
You're talking my language. I've sort of been around. I started my career in '82, so it gives you an idea how old I am. And I can remember back in the '80s, big organizations, the ones that I was involved with, we had EAP programs coming of our
Yeah.
ears. But I think you've hit, for me at least, you've hit the nail in the head around there's a central sort of silver thread around, we could call it culture, but it's organizational life and what it's like to be part of this animal, so to speak. And I just think that, from a cognitive point of view, an educational point of view, we've moved forward in the sense of 50 years ago, organizations were probably less well informed about the need to look after the whole notion of well-being at work, etc. But what's happened is that, as you say, it's elastoplast all the time. The EAP program, the gym membership, the fresh fruit in meeting rooms, the drink plenty of water. It's all kind of bitty to me. And I totally agree with you that I think that there is a contextual thing going on here, which is about how do we make the whole notion of resourcing or building people's resourcing ability to cope with whatever
Yeah.
is happening in the organization as a strategic imperative. I just
Yes.
think there are several factors here. I mean, I'll just name three that are popping to mind. One is the executive and the CFO kind of signs off gym membership, or, we're going to have EAP program or whatever it might be. But actually, there's not a deep buy-in to the whole notion of why it's worthwhile from a strategic business perspective, making sure that the people who are with you when they are with you are productive, happy, and want to be in your organization. The other thing that strikes me is there may be a generational issue going on here as well. What do you think?
The gym membership is interesting because that, along with the fresh fruit, is always used as an example of something that people seem to think isn't effective. When we crunched for the company I work for, Benefits of benefit take up throughout the UK and most of the world to see what the most popular benefits were, the most non-employer funded benefit that was chosen the most was gym membership. So actually, we have a lot of data to suggest that actually it's the most popular choice that employees around the world are making when it's on offer to them. Now, I think that's because lots of people use the gym and a corporate policy that saves you a bit of money, comes out of your salary in some countries, then why wouldn't you do that? I think for us, what we're really focusing on is the industry is still quite new. So I think the wellbeing industry is quite new. If you look at any major change that's taken place, if you take the UK, for example, if you go through the last 200 years of change within HR or the workplace, what you tend to see is a significant change in law or regulation is enacted about 10 years after something big happened. As soon as people started getting killed in the Industrial Revolution in
Yeah.
factories and mines, a law would come in to protect you. I've created a timeline and you can overlay the Depression, the Civil Rights era, the First World War, the Second World, and you can start to pinpoint these things where something happened in society that forced a change in the workplace. If you think about the pandemic as one of those key points, we are still only a couple of years away from that. So we still, and we're only just getting to grips with workplace well-being on the run up to 2020. In the grand scheme of things, we're still in the infancy of understanding what workplace well-being is. On that basis, you will get some big studies that say you're not doing a great job and this isn't working. And for every Oxford study that you show me, I could probably show you another 100 that says the opposite. We're still clambering with that. But I think we've moved away from this idea that people are ill, they leave work to get well, and then they come back to work. The employer is interested in getting that person back to work, functioning and productive as quickly as possible. That's kind of where workplace well-being really began. If somebody's ill because they've broken their leg or had a heart attack, they're not at work. So how do I get them back to here as quickly as possible? And that is the reason why in most organizations, things like private medical are offered, because I want someone to get fixed and back at work quickly. But I think we're moving away from this idea that wellness is just the absence of an illness or an injury. The way I talk about it now is how do we get people to become optimum in the workplace? Ill and unhappy people are not as productive as happy and well people. They don't deliver the same customer service. They don't breed more customer loyalty. They don't innovate. They don't sell more. A huge amount of evidence to back all this up. Most employees sit at what we call average employee functioning. There is an absence of illness. They're not in crisis, but they're not flourishing either. Languishing is a word that gets used quite a lot to describe people who just sit there. And that's where most of us sit. We don't take good care of our well-being. We're not doing all the things we should do. We're not getting 8 hours sleep a day. We're not exercising for 25 minutes a day. We're not eating 5 bits of fruit and vegetables. But we're also a little bit overweight and a little bit inactive. And a lot of the focus in the past has been on what we call kind of negative 10, which is I'm in crisis. The mental health crisis, the stat that everyone would have heard is 1 in 3 people or 1 in 4 people will have a serious mental health problem in their lifetime. If you take that stat, that's only 20% of your workforce. You've still got 80% of the people that do not have a mental health issue in their lifetime, but they're still at that zero. And if we can get them to a +10, it means they're flourishing a little bit more because they're sleeping a little bit better, they're moving a little bit more, they're spending more time socially with their friends and family, they're getting more fulfillment from life and work and all these great things. And you can then start to see actually for the organization, that stuff starts to make a difference because that's where productivity booms, that's where the high performers tend to sit. And so that's really what I talk about when I talk about well-being is I'm not really trying to fix people. I'm not trying to stop a mental health crisis. I'm not trying to stop people getting cancer. I'm just trying to help people flourish and be a bit better than they currently are. And I think the challenge the workplace has had is, those stats like 1 in 5 people or 1 in 4 people getting mental health crisis, 1 in 2 people getting cancer. If you look at the reasons why people get cancer, dementia, strokes, heart disease, all these different things, in many of those cases, it seems to be about only half of your chance of getting those things is modifiable health behavior change. So you can reduce your chances of getting these things, but the reality is, if it's in your body, if it's in your family, you're going to get those things. The best and most progressive employer in the world who commits to all the things we've talked about doing well, being right, will still have employees that get cancer. We'll still have employees that struggle with their mental health. We'll still get diagnosable conditions that need clinical intervention. And so I think we've almost tried to fix people too much, and that's why we're not moving the dial. Those people will still get those conditions with the best will in the world. I'm really interested in this optimal employee functioning is really where we're getting people to where we can say, I can't stop you going through a divorce. I can't stop you falling into debt. I can't stop you having a shit day because you've got care and responsibilities and it's stressing you out. But can I buffer against the negative effects of those things on you? And that to me is where the wellbeing interventions sit. We tend to refer to them as low intensity wellbeing interventions, which are just little ways that we can incrementally support your life so that you're better able to deal with them. You can better adapt and deal with the stuff that life throws at you.
There's something that occurs to me here, and is connected to your idea of the small everyday interventions, enabling people to flourish and thrive and feeling equipped. I think there's a missing piece in the jigsaw puzzle around leadership and managers, literally your line manager,
Yeah.
that somehow there is a feeling out there that it's not down to me, as your line manager. It's not my duty of care to make sure that you've got what it takes to cope. I think that one of the consequences of that kind of approach as a leader, I'm interested in your performance and the targets, KPIs, things that are measurable, but looking after you sort of thing, or looking after you is probably too cotton wool, but making sure that you're in an environment with open communication and the ability to be vulnerable is somehow perceived in a lot of managers' views out of their remit. What's happened is a plethora of organizational initiatives, like all the ones you've mentioned before, and the growth of apps, because it's easier to buy an app and give it to everybody than actually say, I wonder how this, walking into the office one day or wherever you work and going, how are you really doing today? How's your week? Showing that empathy that if you are going through a divorce, yesterday was okay, but maybe today's not so great. And I think that's a big piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Even though the pandemic has accelerated our consciousness around all of this, we were pretty shit at all of this pre-pandemic.
Well-being leadership is this moving target, right? We don't get to leadership and think, right, we've sorted it, we've got it. It will evolve. And part of the challenge we've got with leadership in particular, I think, is there are some generational differences. I'm speaking at an event in London tomorrow with some new report to suggest that younger employees with older managers are far less productive than younger employees with younger managers. So
Wow.
it's part of a longer study, so we don't quite know exactly what's happening there. But we think there might be a disconnect where different generations think of other generations a little bit differently. Um, if you think about most leaders in most organizations, I've put this in the book, leaders get the job because of technical ability or tenure. You're the longest serving person in your team, or you're the best at your job. The leadership role tends to be you're still doing that same job as the rest of your team. You just get paid a bit more and have some more responsibilities and maybe do that day job a little bit less. Whereas it almost feels like it should be a full-time job. I would consider myself a very busy person. I've got a team of 10 people. It's a lot of work to manage 10 people. Simple admin things like holiday requests and changing hour requests, flexible working requests, right the way through to the fact that if you've got 10 people, over the last 12 months, the team members have lost their family members, close family members, have really struggled with some serious mental health problems and all this kind of stuff. And you have to be there and deal with that. I advise all the customers I work with to see the well-being of their team as part of their success metrics. I'll give you a good example. Many years ago, I had a friend working in a utilities provider in the UK, and they decided that health and safety was going to be really, really important to them. And lots of these guys were out on the road. They were traveling salespeople in company cars. And they put these rules in place, which were things like, your car always had to be filled up like half with petrol or something like that, because the car would function better because of it. You always had to reverse into any parking space because evidence said that was safer than driving in kind of head first. And so they would mark you on how safe you were. And your bonus then, part of your bonus was about whether you'd followed these health and safety tips, you'd maintained your car, you did all the checks before you get in, and all this kind of stuff. And I thought that was really interesting. And I think if you start to say, because managers, I don't think, are privy to most of the information we've talked about today.
No.
One of the reasons why the two books I've written have been quite successful is the heavy evidence that sits behind lots of the stuff we're talking about. If I sit down in front of a new manager and say, your team gets better if you do this. Your bonus gets bigger if you do this. Your quality of output gets better because you do this. Your engagement scores are higher. All these measures of success get boosted because you take more of an interest in the lives of your people, expose more vulnerability, as you've said, and all these great things we know make a difference. If people really saw that as an important part of their job and how they were measured and their success rewarded, we would probably start to move the dial on this. There are lots of people already doing that, but there are lots of people who still don't get that, and industries that don't understand that. I think that's part of what needs to change structurally in most organizations is, first of all, are we recruiting and training the right people to be managers in the right way? And do we have well-being as a facet of, as a manager with a team of 10, you have a responsibility to make sure these people have a great experience at work. The more flexible I am with them, the more empathy I have for them, the more they will give back. You will get the odd one or two that might abuse that kind of trust and autonomy, but we shouldn't design anything for the bad apples in our organization. We should design for the majority. I see it with my team. When I need somebody to stay a bit late, pick up something over the weekend, or travel into London to do something, you get that for them because it's a two-way relationship where if I'm helping to support your life and making childcare easier for you, then you're going to want to kind of meet me halfway and do favors for the company as well.
My philosophy has always been, in my own sort of discipline and training around the subject, that I actually take an armed forces kind of approach to promotion. In most organizations, you get the leadership role and they get trained. In the armed forces, in reverse, is get ready first, understand what is the requirement here. Now we'll see if you're ready for that promotion. And I think we're missing a trick here in that respect around well-being. What kind of things have you recommended recently around this subject? Equipping people, reducing lack of well-being at work.
So I think one of the big ones, according to the evidence, is wherever possible, being as vulnerable as you can as a leader.
Role modeling this, you mean?
Exactly, yeah. For some people, it's quite uncomfortable and they don't like doing that. They might be private people, but when people understand that we have lives outside of work as leaders and that we are challenged by those lives, it gives other people permission to speak up. A lot of poor well-being is hidden. If more of our people spoke up and told us they were challenged with something, we could do something about that. The workplace has limited responsibilities and abilities to do that. A really good example would be, I've got a friend whose mother has got a recent diagnosis of Alzheimer's, and he took some time off to take care of her for a couple of days to give the father a break. When his boss found out, he said, I don't want you to use that as annual leave. Like, you weren't holidaying, you were having care and responsibilities. Now, in the UK, a law is about to come in place of April the 1st, which means that person can now get paid for that work. But that was a leader who was basically saying, I'm treating this person as an individual. They've got their challenges. I'm going to give them something that's going to make their life a little bit easier. And then that leader also explained, I know what it's like. I've been through that too. So suddenly they created an emotional connection over a similar challenge. And that kind of stuff really helps because you need your team members to be open with you about what's being challenged. And so I think that's really important. I think probably connected to that, a lot of managers' one-to-ones are about work, and we should be taking a large portion of those meetings and saying to the employee, what do you want to tell me? You set the agenda, you tell me what you want to talk about. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's related to work or not. I find with members of my team that when I run one-to-ones that way, they will tell me lots of things. They won't really know what they want, but I can help them find out what can we do to make you feel a bit better about that thing. A person tends to leave thinking I was listened to and we put something in place that's going to help me. I did it with one of my team members recently. He was looking at maybe wanting to pivot in the future into a product role. So we had a chat about that, and I told them about the features of the kind of people that work in that team. I bought them a product book, gave it to them, and said, have a flick through, see if it's the kind of thing you'd like. And actually, they came back and said, it looks really complicated. It's not what I expected, but thank you for the book. For the sake of £10, it was like, I'm trying to work on your progress. I'm there with you and I'm going on this journey. And I think that really helps. I would say the other third thing as well is nothing boosts employee engagement more than asking people what they think and valuing their opinion. But what kills it really quickly is when we don't act on that. Most companies now will do some kind of annual or monthly survey, and people go in and say, I'm not happy about this, I don't like this. And then the next survey comes in 4 weeks later, and I'm like, well, what's the point of me giving these answers? Because nobody's responded to what I've said before. Nobody's telling me what's being put in place. And I think sometimes the answer might be, we just can't do what you've requested. But we should be going back to our employees and saying we can't do that. And these are the reasons why we can't do it. But maybe this is something we should consider for the future. And we'll get back to you, and then committing to getting back to them. I think that's really important. People will just stop telling you. If you had a manager that ignored everything you said, you stop telling the truth. The worst kind of employee before an employee gets really disengaged and leaves is they go quiet. They just decide I can't be bothered giving you my opinion, and it's deadly when that happens, I think.
Absolutely. As you were speaking, I was thinking there's some real fundamentals here. The quality and the nature of the dialogue that might exist between team member and line manager at whatever level in the organization. The other word that comes to mind is the notion, well, John Adair, was talking about this in the early 70s around needs and sort of the needs of individuals, and their needs might change, whether it's to do with physical, mental, or any other kind of well-being, the cost of living crisis we're living through. So needs for the individual, but then also because we tend to work in some kind of collaborative relationship of team or group, the needs of the many. I think we just lean too much towards one approach will work for every situation and every person all the time. And I think this is a fundamental requirement of how we engage in conversations. The other thing that I've encountered in the leadership development space has often been that if I get trained, then that's it, I'm fixed, and now I'm going to be a good leader. I said, think about the question you've just asked in a one-to-one conversation. What do you want to talk about? Well, if you've got not the most open and psychologically safe relationship with that team member, they're not going to answer that question openly. But if you asked it enough over time, they might twig that actually you might be interested genuinely about the answers they might give you. So go on.
I think you've got to empower leaders and give them permission to have an element of ownership over this stuff so they can put people before policy. So in that example I gave you of a friend of mine whose boss said, you know what, take those 2 days. That's not a formal policy. It's not sanctioned by HR. It's not a formal process that any manager can do. But that manager has got the bandwidth to say, do you know what? This is a good employee and they do a lot of great things for us and they're consistently high. But now they've got this new challenge in their life that they didn't want, that they didn't cause. How can I help them deal with that? Clearly, that person coming back to work then will be incredibly grateful for the support they've got. And so I think managers need to have the ability to, at their discretion, because they know the team. And I think it plays to your point of these blanket policies don't always work because people are different in different teams. People are different in different locations. If you look at public health, why it's divvied up around the UK in the way that it is, it's because somebody aged 80 living in the middle of nowhere in the Welsh countryside has different well-being needs to somebody who's 25 living in the city of London. So, we've got to be malleable with a lot of this stuff as well. If we empower and trust our leaders to make the right calls with a bit of guidance from us, I think you solve the well-being problem more, and especially because I would suspect in a workplace context, 70% of somebody's well-being is managed or influenced directly by their manager. And we actually have some really interesting evidence that your leadership and your workplace now has more of an influence on your well-being than your doctor does. So yeah, leadership is a really, really big part of this. And I think it's a lot, right? We're changing the role of leadership. As we've talked about, you're telling somebody the way you understood leadership from when you were 20 is now very different to where you're 40. The way you were trained might not be fit for purpose anymore.
One of the things I find personally disappointing is we've probably known these things for ages, like forever. And I just feel, why haven't we looked at it from the right end of the telescope?
I think we are in the midst of change. If you think about what I said before about every 50 years or so, something major happens and change happens on the back of that. We look back over every single major change that's taken place, and in most instances say that was a good thing. It was best for our businesses, it was best for our employees. That we've had the 8-hour working day, the 5-day working week for over 100 years now. It is time for a change. And I think the reason the conversation about the 4-day working week is persisting, it's because we have this evidence that's emerging that says actually we should be doing less hours because we've been able to do more by technology. We can have Zoom meetings now that make us more productive because they're taking 6 hours worth of travel away from our days. We've got all these different tools that come in, and the promise of new technology is always that it will improve our productivity. The 4-day working week will become a reality for most organizations pretty quickly, I think, this side of 2020, 30 for lots of companies. And that is a reflection of the fact that people don't want to and can't continue to work in the way that they have.
Yeah.
91% of people said they felt extremely stressed at one point last year. These aren't pandemic figures. These are people that are worried about wars and the cost of living crisis and a looming recession and a housing crisis. We've got a mental health crisis. In the UK, the number of people on long-term sick equates to just under 5% of the country. You've got 5% on long-term ill health. You've got the average number of sick days now to a record high of just over 8 days. So this is all impacting the employer. We have more of a reason to soften the blow of those things happening, because for us, that gets more people in work, productive, innovative. If you look at how health is currently funded in most places, if the workplace doesn't help you with this, who is? Because I think if you look at the UK at the moment, with the customers I work with, if Joe worked for me and wanted to speak to a mental health nurse or a counsellor, I'd be able to get you to speak to one of those in the next hour. If you wanted to go on the NHS, you'd be waiting 12 weeks just to have a conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
So I would argue that whether you think this is fair or not, the employer is in a unique opportunity to have this impact on people's lives to the extent that actually I think it will drive change we need to see in society. Richard Edelman, the founder of Edelman, says that he believes that employers as well have the ability to kind of effective change society in a positive way, in a way that the government isn't doing at the moment.
I think there are a couple of things that are emerging for me. One is at an organizational level, having a sense of why even just worrying about well-being at work is important and it's strategic imperative to the business success and everything else, and setting some approaches and maybe offerings as well, whatever those offerings might be. But then I think you get sucked down, and I've been saying this for years, it gets sucked down to the line manager and the team and the individuals in that team, and what it feels like to be here. And is there that connection? Is there somebody that's got your back as a team member that's trying to understand, what does your world look like? What are the pressures and non-pressures that you're experiencing while you're with us? And trying to co-create an environment of wellness that's peculiar to us, rather than let's just lift something off the shelf and stick it on because that's going to be okay for us. So
there's a combination of things you do. If you think about something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you have, the basics is kind of food and shelter and all that kind of stuff. If you mix that around, you solve some problems, but you create new problems. And so if you think about workplace well-being as like two halves of a block, you've got the kind of fundamental stuff we talked about, which is the recognition, autonomy, regular one-to-ones, vulnerability, all these kind of stuff. And then you've got that layer, which is the bit that gets a lot of criticism, which is those low intensity interventions which help you buffer against the stuff that life happens to you. So that's where your financial education support, your benefits and things like that might sit. If you took the bottom piece away and just left people with great benefits, all these digital wellbeing platforms, free fruit in the office, gym memberships and everything, it won't achieve anything. But if you just left the other stuff as well, life is still going to impact people. It's the combination of those two things together. And that is what is missing from lots of the research and thought leadership in this space, is that actually we shouldn't be pitting all these elements of well-being together. We should be saying they're all really important. In the Maslow's hierarchy of needs example, if you've got food but no shelter, You're feeling full and you've got the energy, but you're freezing cold and you're soaking wet and you're open to the elements. Likewise, if you've got a roof over your head but no food, it's almost like they're both terrible situations, really. It's a combination of those two that start to make a difference to people. And I think that's what we're really talking about today.
The bigger picture for me is that it's out in the open. It's a growing subject with more people involved in the debate and the trying to figure out what's possible here. And boy, I think it's needed. Just going back to the pandemic for one final second, you and I have had this conversation before. I know that if nothing else, the pandemic or that experience of that moment in time accelerated a lot of things that were in the pipeline before. Let's carry on with accelerating our perception of it, our understanding of it, and doing something about it. Gethin, thanks so much for your time. It's been really brilliant talking to you. Well, that's all for today's episode of GOBO. My thanks to Gethin and to you, dear listener. If you're still here, congratulations. You survived my ramblings. My brain is buzzing. If you enjoyed this episode, or even if you didn't and just want to be polite, give us a like, drop a comment, or better yet, hit subscribe so you don't miss more of me going on. And if you know anyone else who loves a good chinwag, share it with them. Misery loves company, right? Thanks for tuning in, and remember, the real magic happens when you keep the conversation going. Until next time, bye for now.